Thank you. So first off, I would also like to thank the IMC for both the funding and for the opportunity to talk a bit how it's going with our project. So my name is Jonathan Doucette. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science here in Aarhus. I'm doing the project together with Roman Stavnskær, who's an associate professor at the same department. So our project is basically about explaining the emergence of democracy in Denmark. It is basically motivated by this empirical pattern that I'm trying to showcase over here, which is the average turnout in Danish elections from the first elections around the 1850s all the way to today. And the main development to note here is that there's a massive increase in turnout over time, and this is just turnout among eligible voters, so it's not driven by additional people being given access to vote. So we want to know, why was it that the Danish population became so much more engaged in politics during the first 70 or so years of having elections in Denmark? And this was not in the original data, but it is the same pattern for political competitions. So during the first elections, most people could only vote for one candidate, but over time the number of candidates you could choose from also increased massively. So we wanted to find out, why was this the case? Why did this happen? So to do that, we needed new data, or better data on this development, because we only had very aggregated information about, for instance, turnout. So we used the funding to get some help from student coders to code all lower house elections from 1849 until 1924, which we plan to publicly share once we're done with the geocoding and validating parts of the data collection. So the current status of our project is that we have coded somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 election districts across 28 elections. So that's about 33,000 observations, and we have coded data on the turnout, the competitiveness, that is the number of different candidates you can choose from, the vote shares of these candidates, and the profession of these candidates. So some of these things we're not specifically planning to use ourselves, but we hope that others could make use of this data in their research projects. So at the moment, we're in the process of geocoding these districts. So now we just have the districts, but we don't really know where in Denmark they're located. For a lot of questions, then the data is not really usable yet, but hopefully it will be soon. So specifically, what we're looking at are these old publications from Statistics Denmark, where they list the number of voters and the number of eligible voters that voted, and then the number of votes for each candidate, along with the profession of each candidate. So in this case, there's a person from the military and a lawyer basically running for election in the Præstø Amt. So these were the kind of documents that our student coders were looking at. So some initial patterns that we find in the data is that, let's see if we can, is that we basically replicate the turnout finding. So this is the average turnout among eligible voters again for each election. And what we see is that for the first few elections, it's basically a stable level of turnout and no real increase. However, for around the 1872, we see a continued increase in turnout at elections. The weird outlier here is the 1950 war election, where most candidates ran uncontested. For many reasons, that's a bit of a weird election. And what we know from newer data is that basically since the 1920s, turnout has remained consistently high in Denmark. So this was really the period where it changed massively. And it is a similar pattern, although not exactly the same for competition. So this is the share of districts where there's at least 2 candidates, so you have some sort of choice in the election over time. Here we see the same pattern with relative stability for the first elections, and then an increase, although with some going back and forth until the 1900s, and then basically all districts become contested. One of the things that, for instance, happened in 1862 is that the different parts of what we today know as Venstre banded together into one party. And finally, there's also some interesting patterns in who runs for political office in Denmark. So if we look at the first elections, priests were some of the most common candidates, and then of course you had lawyers and farmers, and the traditional elites, the estate owners. But over time, some of these professions changed. So priests became a little less visible in politics, while journalists or newspaper editors became one of the main professions that were running for political office. So of course we have some speculations about what could help explain these patterns. So our initial idea was that we're drawing on this older literature arguing that it was the Danish folk high school movement that galvanized political engagement. And so this is, for instance, a quote by Hal Koch, who argues that these enterprises, that is folks' high schools, became a practical schooling in democracy, where one was taught to negotiate and understand and accept differences and to cooperate. To correlate these two things, we have also previously collected data on the establishment of Danish folk high schools. This is a map of all the folk high schools established before 1900, and the data is from the Højskolehistorisk Forening, so the Association of Folk High School History, who has been so kind as to give us access to their data. So basically, we expect that folk high schools taught civic skills, which imply greater political participation, but also greater political efficacy. So former students organized political associations and political events and ran for office and founded additional folk high schools. And in addition, the period that we're looking at, from the 1850s to 1900, was a period of immense political and economic change in Denmark, which previous research have shown us are opportune moments for cultural change. So there are at least a number of good reasons to suspect that folk high schools had an effect on these kind of outcomes. But that will be for the future part of the project. Our plans is to end up with two outcomes. One is a paper that basically presents our data set and makes it available for other researchers to use in their own research. And then a second paper that looks specifically at the potential role of folk high schools. Thank you so much for listening.